Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi, thank you for joining me this morning.
I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, so you are an author. Would you like to give us the rundown of your work and your specialties?
Sure, sure. I'm an author. I'm sort of an author. And I was thinking about this morning because I've been involved in a Kickstarter for a friend of mine who I said to her, you need to write a book. And then we found a publisher who was sort of interested and they wanted me to do it first and then me to do it with her because I have books already published. And we were like, no, this is a woman who's a person of color. We need to center her work. We need to do her first. We had to do a Kickstarter to raise enough money to get the publisher to do her first. And we got all of our Kickstarter money this month. So I'm totally celebrating.
Yeah.
But I started writing my books because three of my friends got together and they said, Sarah, you have to write a book. And I was thinking this morning, we all need to say this to each other and we all need to help each other write books. So here's the one that my three friends got together with me. They started me out. They worked with me for a year. And then they were like, you should have your book written already. And I was like, ah! It took me another 4 years, but then I got it done. And it's called Your Resonant Self. And it's a book about the neuroscience of self-compassion and about how trauma impacts our bodies. And then I went out in the world and I was teaching the neuroscience of self-compassion. And people would be out in the world and they would say, this is all beautiful, but I just can't do what you're asking me to do. And when I would inquire what was in the way, it turned out it was their integrity. Like it was against their integrity to be warm with themselves. So then I wrote this book, the Your Resonant Self Workbook, which talks about the unconscious contracts that we make with ourselves to do things that seem a little counterintuitively, maybe not so life-serving, but why are we doing them? We're doing them because it balanced our family's nervous system when we were little. So if I like myself, does it completely radically destroy my entire family system for there to be a family member that really likes themselves? Or is the family woven together with pain and contempt, which sometimes happens in our families? Other things too, grief, unprocessed grief, unheld grief. Yeah. So we can have these contracts where we're like, I'm not going to be kind to myself in order to stay with my mom because she's really lonely, no matter the cost to myself. And our bodies have these contracts. And until we give them words, we can't really release them. So the workbook is a kind of a journey through releasing. And
Yeah.
then day before yesterday, Affirmations for
Yes.
Turbulent Times came out. And this one is all about like what happens if we name our traumas and our life experience and then do our affirmations so that the little guy on the shoulder that's saying, it can't possibly be true that you will live in abundance gets a little bit of calming. Like you need some acknowledgement, little guy, that we have not lived in abundance, that our family has not lived in abundance for 7 generations. Just like, of course you would worry about that. And then we get to say, and my true essential self is of an abundant nature. Everything around me is abundance and I am abundance. And it's an entirely different experience once you start to give words to the truths that need to be said instead of pretending they aren't there.
Yeah. I have your book and I've read your book, and I have to say that the thing that, and it took, several chapters to realize this, but I think this is the best example I've ever seen of you integrating the warmth and the kindness that you talk about in the book, but the way you've written the book, that is integrated the entire way through in the voice of the writing. And I think
Oh,
this is probably the best example I've ever seen of that being so successful. Because the
wow.
the voice of you as the writer is the kindness and the warmth that you talk about. And there's never a point in time where there's any kind of harshness or roughness or any kind of promotion of being harsh with oneself, or a lot of times in Western culture we're let's be tough and let's work through it, and it's not needed in this material. And you've done just a beautiful job of writing it in a way that is constantly reinforcing the warmth and the kindness. So the question I have for you is, what is something that you don't think people give themselves enough credit for with everything you've studied and all your work?
People have no idea how much they love. They have no idea. We come into this world with such huge hearts, and then we have to kind of close them down because nobody knows that they've got a huge heart. So everybody's kind of walking around with these closed off hearts. So we have to walk around with our heart closed off too. And humans have just an enormous capacity for love that we don't even realize. I mean, that thing about integrity and whether or not we have self-warmth, it comes from love. It's like, my love says that I want to love integrity and my mom's well-being more than I want to love my own well-being. It's just mind-blowing once we get into it with people.
Yeah. So one of my favorite things in the book too, and I think you discuss this possibly in the introduction, it's very, very early on, but one of the concepts that I absolutely loved is kind of building on what you just discussed, but it's the notion that any individual occurrence, just in a moment, when you treat somebody with warmth and kindness, depending on their history, that could actually be healing. So it's pretty powerful just to think that just walking around, literally being kind and warm to people, that we could actually be healing.
Yes, offering a different option to people's brains. And the kindness and the warmth comes through what I like to call resonance and accompaniment. So it's kind of different than, I often think about the words empathy and compassion, and how we can be driving in our car and have empathy and compassion for people that are outside our car, and we never even have a conversation with them. But we can't be in resonance with people outside of our car because we actually have to have contact and connection, and the other person needs to say, yes, you understand me. And in that, yes, you understand me, that's telling us that we've found a place where our bodies are vibrating with the bodies of other people in the world. And then if we do it over time, then rather than just for an instant, then it starts to become accompaniment. And there are these moments of sweetness with perfect strangers that are resonant moments. And then with our friends or people that are close to us, coworkers or neighbors or family members, it turns into even more healing because they start to bring us inside their brains. Like I would develop a whole set of neurons. If you and I were best friends, I would have a whole set of Nicole neurons inside my own brain that would both inform me about you when I thought about you, like tell me a little bit about what you might like or what you don't like or what adventure we could plan together. But also I would carry you with me. Like when I was having something difficult happen, I get really scared when I go to the dentist. So I would be able to think of you and my heart rate would fall and my blood pressure would fall. And I would be resourcing myself through our connection. And it would have a significant meaning for me inside of my own brain and with my own stress levels in life. So we touch each other and change each other in moments, and in relationships, we change each other profoundly.
Yeah. Now, one of the topics, and I think it's called naming.
Yeah.
Do I have that correct? So like with what you just mentioned, like your fear and anxiety as you go to the dentist. I love the section where you discuss naming, and I probably don't quite have my head wrapped around how powerful the concept is. But I do have my own example where I was working on a car and I should have been wearing gloves and I was using a Sawzall, and I ended up having, not with a saw, but I ended up with a little cut on my hand. And I really wasn't happy about it. I had this weird anxiety, and I'm not a very anxious person. But finally, I just looked at my hand and said, I'm mad I cut my hand.
Oh,
And then I
beautiful.
was okay. It was the
Oh, that's so
weirdest thing.
cool.
But when I got to the naming section in the book, I immediately had an example of this is real. So if I'm feeling angry, if I'm feeling frustrated, if I'm feeling intimidated, if I'm just naming those feelings. So can you talk about that a little bit and that whole concept? And I don't think I'm doing a very good job of explaining it, but
Oh,
I
I
love
love
the
it.
concept.
I love it. Well, this comes from it comes from a lot of experience for me personally, because I do trauma healing work with this material with people all over the world. It used to be physically all over the world. Now it's on Zoom all over the world. But really, when we talk about this kind of naming, what we're looking for is what is the um, what is alive for us in our body and our brain in relationship to this experience that's not been named before, or that's complex and multi-layered or trying to happen at the same time. So for example, let's say that like an injury, this is a really interesting thing because there are so many layers to work with injuries. Let's say I burn myself, which is slightly different than a cut. I burn myself, and the first experience is shock, right? So if I'm very carefully naming this experience, my first guess for myself, and it's always good to put question marks even when we're talking to ourselves. My first guess for myself would be, Sarah, do you need any acknowledgement of shock? Did you stop breathing? And then the next one, just like you, are you so angry at yourself for not paying attention? Do you just want there to be an attentiveness so that you're safe in the world? And then, then there might be a layer of sadness and sorrow about the level of overwhelm that I'm experiencing that caused me not to pay attention and burn myself. And then there might be a layer of what I call alarmed aloneness, which is like trying to make dinner without support and missing either a partner who might be a support or a kid who might help, or missing a mom who might have loved to cook and has died recently. I mean, there can be so many ways that we might have grief and alarmed aloneness. Now, my experience with injuries is that when we name the emotions, our injuries start to hurt less. And the reason I chose a burn was because for a long time, my burns wouldn't shift. I would do all the emotions for myself, and I would be like, gosh, it works with everything else. It works when I pull a muscle. It works when I get a bruise. Why doesn't it work when it's burned? And then I started talking to the cells themselves, and I was like, cells of Sarah's hand, do you need acknowledgement of cell death? Do you need acknowledgement that your fellow cells have died? And the pain stopped. And I was like, oh my goodness. It was an entire dimension of cellular experience that I was missing when I was doing my naming. And it's been extraordinary. I mean, it persists. For some reason, that's what my body needs. I don't know if that's what other people's bodies need, but
Yeah.
they need acknowledgement of my body needs acknowledgement also, and naming also of what's happening with the cells themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm explaining very well either, Nicole.
No,
How am I
no,
doing?
no. No, I think you are, because you also discuss how I think you mentioned somewhere in there that when someone else is with you, and I think you use exercise as an example, but exercise hurts less when someone's with you. So
Yeah.
even though it is your own hand, you're still, treating it as though it's another entity and that you can be there
Yeah.
with it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
get to be really sweet with our bodies in this modality.
Yeah. So I want to talk about trauma, and I also want to talk about anger. I know trauma comes first in the book, but but with the identifying and the naming, I think anger kind of flows in next. And
Sure.
one of the things that I've always thought, and I'm someone who, I'm pretty happy, but I've, like everybody else, I've had my stuffs. I spent some time in counseling as a kid. As an adult, when I identify something unhealthy that I don't like, I go back for a tune-up. I have no problem doing that. I actually love it. It's exciting because I get to find things out. It's like, what am I missing? What piece am I missing? The thing, so I've, and I think how I would explain it is that counseling, when I've, especially as a child, I think what it's taught me is how to figure out what's bothering me, what's wrong, what is happening, and that's why as an adult, if I'm missing pieces, I go back for a tune-up. But I feel like it's really helped me figure out how I feel and what's bothering me, and not just spinning, but to know, okay, this is what's bothering me about something, and applying that to your anger topic. I like how the meditation is replay an instance where you were angry. What exactly set you off? So I love that you're basically teaching people how to analyze what was it. Not just this whole huge situation with nuanced movements between multiple people, but what was it?
Yeah. And the amygdala kind of tends to jolt us into all of the possible experiences of anger. It stores memory. There are two big memory storage units in the brain and one of them is the amygdala, and one of them is the hippocampus. And the amygdala stores memory by their emotional tone, which is why when we get mad at a partner, we start to remember everything they ever did. And then in 1989, that gosh darn person took my car on Christmas Day when I wanted to see my mother. It's just like we have the entire litany of complaints that come pouring out of us when we get angry at somebody, which is why we say to our nearest and dearest, you always take my car and don't tell me. You never ask consent. It's like, because for the amygdala, that particular storage little unit that stores trauma memories, it stores them by emotional tone. And then, like you said, we can get flooded. We can have a sense of our body being flooded. The cortisol can start to go. If it's rage, it's substance P and glutamate, and boom, we're like on fire. So part of the work of this is like, okay, and this time, what's this, not the whole string, what's this little Christmas tree light telling us? What happened in this moment? How did that light up and light everything else up? What happened there? And when we begin to do that, we start to differentiate that Christmas tree light from the entire string of lights. And we, I just want to acknowledge that Christmas is a very Christian-oriented holiday, and there could be Kwanzaa lights and Hanukkah lights and all kinds of things. So Diwali lights. And so when we bring our attention and our care to that one moment, and it's a bit like any one of these emotional moments has a lot of complexity. And because it's been stressful, and because we were too alone in these moments, because if we're truly accompanied in a moment, it tends not to be a trauma moment. Our trauma moments all tend to be moments when we've been left too alone. So if we're too alone in that trauma moment, the amygdala goes, oh, this is too much. And it actually creates a flood of cortisol that takes out the hippocampus. The hippocampus is our time stamper. So there's no time stamping. There's no order. There's no chronological order. There's no differentiation. There's no context. There's no sense making. And as soon as we touch that memory, boom, the flare happens again, as so many of us have experienced with post-traumatic stress. And with the recurring of intrusive memories from difficult situations, we feel the same way. Like I can think of times when I was embarrassed when I was a child, and I can flush, absolutely blush now because my body thinks I'm still there as soon as I touch the memory. That's what the amygdala does. It has no sense of time. So we say, what was the worst moment? And then we begin to be with and resonate with. And part of what rage does is rage is extremely protective of resources. So we want to know when we have an experience of great rage or great anger, or even little anger, what were the resources that were at stake? What resources were under threat? This is easy to answer sometimes. Like if people are really angry and jealous, the resource of the relationship itself feels like it's at stake. If people are in driving and they have road rage, then there may be a sense that their inviolability is at stake, that their life is at stake, that there's danger. If people are angry politically, there may be deep values about how they want the world to be run that are at stake. So as we start to kind of touch into those deep values and the context, what we're starting to do is we're inviting the hippocampus to come back online because it holds context. And as the amygdala calms and stops turning off the hippocampus, it starts going, oh, and of course I was angry in that moment. And this is what was at stake. And I was afraid I didn't matter, or that I wasn't being seen, or that I wasn't being loved, or wasn't being cared for. And then things start to relax.
Yeah.
I have one more thing to say about anger, but I want to just check in with you and see how I'm doing here on making sense.
Yes. Yeah. So it kind of sounds like the amygdala might be. So I suspect that it's a little bit naughty. It kind of does its own thing. It can kind of run wild. I have to ask though, and I don't recall reading about this in the book, but is the amygdala also where the positive emotions come from as well? So is it the flip side of all the good and all the, like when you just feel intense love for family, is it also from the amygdala?
Yeah. We cannot bond and attach without our amygdala. We need that little sucker. It's a good little being inside of our brain, and it's doing a really good job. And part of what happens when when our brain can't tell what time it is, what's really happening is that memory is available for healing. For as long as it lights up our body, we can do trauma healing and work with it. So whatever's alive for us, whatever we can feel like speeds up our heart rate or gives us stomach ache or makes her stop breathing or kind of clench, those things are all available for resonant accompaniment and healing.
Yeah. Did you have something else on anger you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I wanted to say that that the American neuroscientist who studied emotions named Jaak Panksepp, he discovered that the only way you could turn down the anger circuit just all by itself was to drug everything into submission, was to turn down the volume on the entire experience of somebody's life energy, which we often call depression. But that if we link our rage circuit with our care circuit, linking anger and love, then we can calm the rage circuit without having to turn down all of our life energy. So coming back to our huge hearts and starting to understand them as the root of our angers starts to create a different kind of holding of the anger experience than anything we've ever experienced before.
Do you have an example of how someone could link the rage with the caring circuit?
Yeah, absolutely. It would probably start to involve more things too, because rage is a big old thing. But let's say we have a cousin a cousin we loved very much who got in a drunk driving accident. We may be completely ballistically angry at that person and want to yell at them about how people love them and how could they do such a thing and why aren't they taking care of themselves. And then if we start to notice that it's because we love that person so much and we're so scared for them and we don't want to lose them, then it starts to sound different. Like, I'm so angry at you, and we can even call them names. You pea-brained, piece of peanut husk. You don't know what you're doing. Do you understand how much I love you? Do you understand, that I'm scared because I don't want to live on this world without you? And then that starts to change the dialogue, and it calms our bodies instead of just working us up into higher and higher and higher levels of rage. We start to be able to touch into our care and our love, and also the possibility of loss, which brings a consciousness of grief and alarmed aloneness with it.
Yeah. That makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
Yep. I think there have been many of us that have had those moments where we were in not the exact situation, but a situation where you are so angry with someone because you do love them, and all the fear that comes with the loss, and, what if they get hurt? And, it's from a good place, but it's still, it's that, it's a contradictory because you're angry because you love someone so much.
That's right. And it can be scary for the person to receive the anger without knowing about the love.
Yeah. So now trauma is some of your more current work, something you're doing right now?
Working with trauma?
Yeah.
It's always there.
Gotcha.
It's always a part of everything. Yeah.
So now in this book, let's see, I think these two things that I found that I really liked, I think they might actually be connected. Betrayal of trust after trauma. In Western civilization, especially the United States, we say a lot of things like, be kind, but we don't really clarify what that means. And there's lots of other examples, forgive yourself, but we don't give tangible examples. So we say these things and we don't really define them. And I think the betrayal of trust after trauma, which is basically when someone tries to tell their story, and this is from your book, when they try to tell their story, how it's received by others influences how terrible that trauma may affect them. So it may not even be the trauma itself. But I think this is an example of, when we say be kind, well, maybe it's also be receptive. Do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, this is right in this moment as you're speaking about this. One of the things that I'm thinking about is the long history of the way that women who have been sexually assaulted have been received by authorities when they come to try to speak about what happened. And then, of course, the court cases, which so often result in nothing. And so if we really acknowledge that the experience of trauma extends into how are we received by our communities after the trauma, then we'll start to understand that often for these women and also for men who have been sexually assaulted, the experience of how they've been received is the most traumatic part. Like the experience at the police station is worse than the experience of the actual assault itself sometimes, or the experience of being bullied and finally working up the courage to tell somebody that you've been bullied, and that person saying, oh, you just have to be tough and deal with it yourself, then leads to kind of this sense that the only person we can count on is our own self, and we don't get to be affiliated with others. We don't get to experience any kind of real movement for change, because movements for change happen at the systemic level. They don't happen at the personal level. And so
we could go into trauma. So speaking about trauma again, actually. So, and I'm going to link this to what's kind of going on in the country with diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism. But in the book you mention, and I absolutely love this, I think it is essential. Page 119, you say, the ones who live through the trauma are the ones who get to tell their story and decide what is true for them. And I think this obviously goes back to the betrayal of trust after trauma. But when I relate it to anti-racism, this is the time to listen. Yes, I think that's what this amounts to is, the people of color in this country, what they've dealt with, without being someone, or with being someone who is never going to be able to understand it to that level. If people share trauma of any kind, I think that something that's very important in all of our lives is just to know when it's time to listen.
Time to listen and time to work for systemic change. So just like the little kid in our example who was looking at who was trying to find help for the bullying, the thing that's been proven to help with bullying in schools most is to have a pervasive anti-bullying culture that runs through every policy and runs through every staff member and runs through every student. And so if a child is asking for help about bullying, what they really want is for the whole system to change so that it doesn't happen to them anymore, so it doesn't happen to anybody else anymore. So our job, because we're all part of the system, we're all part of all of our systems, and we all have a voice. And of course, we have contracts that make us believe that our voice doesn't matter. We need to let go of our contracts so that we can begin to do what Ibram Kendi calls, the anti-racism work itself of making sure that any systems that we have any voice in whatsoever move more towards inclusion and every voice mattering.
Yeah. So your most recent book, I believe, is on affirmations.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about affirmations and how people can use them and people that maybe aren't familiar with them?
Yeah. Affirmation. My editor at Norton actually asked for this book, and she asked for it because she kept telling her family about all the books she was editing that were all about trauma. She's the mental health editor at Norton, and one of her kids said to her, "Why don't you do a book that makes people feel good, Mom?" So she called me up and she said, "Sarah, you want to do this book? I think we should have a book of affirmations for turbulent times." She already had the title, I think. And I was like, wow, I love it that I'm being invited. And affirmations. And I started to look at the research into affirmations, and I discovered that they really support people's immune system and well-being and mood and help to lift the heaviness of and the difficulties of daily life. And I was like, and at the same time, how can we make them even more effective? What happens if we name truth in relationship to something that's difficult? So here's the book. And then if I just kind of open it at random, it opens to making mistakes. And the truths that we might want to name are, after this, I'll just read one sentence of the truth tellings, which are called wonderings. After you have made a mistake, even if no one else would think of it as a mistake, is the shame so strong internally that you can't even believe that you still belong? So then we're like naming what actually happens when we make a mistake. And then the affirmation, I'll just read the first couple sentences of the affirmation. I feel unconditional warmth for myself. I understand that mistakes are necessary for learning, and I learn everything I can from my mistakes. I celebrate knowing that mistakes mean I am alive and willing to take the risks necessary for learning and growing.
Wonderful. So it refocuses on the positive aspects, which are absolutely true.
Exactly.
Of course we make mistakes. That's sometimes the fun of it.
And sometimes it's horrifically shame-inducing, but we can still come back to learning from them, and and also discovering our unconscious contracts in relationship with them, of course.
Yeah.
So that we go easier on ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with all the work you've done, what priority do you think that you value more than you used to?
Relationship.
Yeah.
I came into this just like my whole brain was set up to be a little person on my own little piece of ice floating in the ocean, separated from everybody else. And now, of course, we've got global climate crisis and all our little ices are melting. It's no longer possible to believe that we are so separate in some ways. It is for brains possible to believe it because there's a whole cultural momentum that makes people believe that they must depend only on themselves and that people are not reliable, based on very good historical evidence but still we need we need to be stepping into a healing of some of that old trauma, because that's the voice of trauma. Whenever we say always or never, it's the voice of trauma. So if we say people are never trustworthy, that is a big red flag that we have lived through very traumatic experiences where people truly were not trustworthy. And when we start to hear it that way, again, it's sort of that invitation to the hippocampus to begin to step into a larger context, which is part of what we need for the affirmations, a sense not only of the trauma that we've lived through and how it makes us think that our negative ideas are truth, but also like that we all have a kind of a core essential self that is remarkably generous and sweet once it starts to get connected with the outer world, rather than being kind of blockaded behind huge protective walls of unconscious contracts that keep us from being with the world as it is.
Yeah. I think I'm hoping that there will be a movement back towards community. We as a species have been successful because of our societies, because we work together. And I think with, as much as I love technology, I think technology has done a lot of things that have made us a little too siloed. Missing.
Siloed is a very good word.
Yeah. So I'm really hoping that there's a movement coming up soon, especially with the younger millennial generations and Gen Z, because I think they're the most affected by technology.
Yeah.
And I really hope that they find the value in real relationships.
Yeah. My experience with Gen Z is that they're hungry for real relationships.
Good.
Yeah.
So at this point with your career and with your life, how is your time best spent?
My time is best spent writing books and doing things like this, where we're talking to people and somebody might catch an ear with their ear, something that says to them that they belong, that they're not an outsider. And so that people can, I would just love it. Love to reach as many people as possible with the message that self-warmth is both doable and exquisite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that it changes our world.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any, I don't want to say advice necessarily, but if somebody was wanting to get started on building the relationships, doing the work, do you just have any quick recommendations for where they can just start? Because I know it can be intimidating if this isn't something that you've ever had much to do with.
Right. I think starting with the guided meditations is a possibility, because they're free. They're easy to download from my website. I have a website, sarahpeyton.com, and there's a Your Resonant Self website as well, where both of them you can find the free meditations on, also on Insight Timer. And to begin to listen to them and see if they speak to you, to see if the kindness and the realness and the strange radical practice of turning towards ourselves with open arms, sort of, it feels good to you. That's the best place to start. Or if you're a reader, then start with books. And if you like to watch videos, then watch me and Nicole. And and then there are other videos on my YouTube channel, the Sarah Peyton YouTube channel.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you for joining me, Sarah. Your book is amazing. I have read it. I think it is excellent. The concepts in here, I think, are absolutely essential, especially if someone is either starting or if someone is looking for some fine-tuning or some ideas or some next steps in increasing their happiness. I think it is written in a way that is extremely approachable. Whether someone does have experience in psychology, neuroscience, interpersonal studies, or someone's just beginning, I think it's very approachable at whatever your level is. So I highly recommend it. Yeah, and I don't know, this has been just a wonderful experience, Sarah. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
And happy to be here with you. And many people don't read the book when they're doing a podcast with me, and I just feel like, wow, I'm sort of walking on air that you read the book and that you liked it.
Absolutely. Yes, it was wonderful. Yeah. All right. Thank you.